Hi, folks. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Aretha Franklin's recording of a gospel classic called What a Friend We Have in Jesus. And we're going to use it as a lens to look at the larger relationship between gospel and the blues. And the reason that this tune is front of mind for me right now is in my pop music theory and oral skills classes at NYU, we recently did the unit on blues melody. And that, to me, is one of the most important units in the semester because, first of all, blues is a very important, beautiful, and influential music, but also it's not well theorized. It's not well explained using the conventional frameworks that we use for analyzing Western classical music or jazz even. I think it's really important that we look at this music just starting from the music itself. Rather than trying to apply some sort of theory framework to it that doesn't fit it very well, we just want to take the music as it is and see what patterns and generalizations we can derive from it. And there might not be a formalized theoretical system that we can use to explain how it works. But whether there is one or not, the music itself is there for us to learn from, and we don't really need an abstract theoretical framework either. Now, here all this time I've been talking about the blues, but this song we're going to be talking about is not a blues song, it's a gospel song. And there is a very complex relationship between gospel and blues that we're going to unpack as the episode goes along. In class, the reason that it's so important to talk about the blues, other than the blues itself, is because there are so many styles of American popular and vernacular music that use what Richard Rapani calls the blues system. So Richard Rapani, in a book about R&B, says, okay, there's the blues as a genre, but then there's also the blues system, which is these collections of pitches and these harmonies and these melodic ideas and these rhythms and these timbres, these vocal techniques and instrument techniques that combine to make a music sound bluesy. So blues obviously uses the blues system, but so do R&B, rock, country, jazz for sure. I mean, it's hard to find a form of American popular music since 1920 that doesn't use the blues system. And so gospel uses the blues system very, very extensively. And nobody sings blues-flavored gospel better than Aretha Franklin. Aretha's recording of What a Friend We Have in Jesus is from a live album and a documentary film, both called Amazing Grace, filmed in 1972. The film is on YouTube, and it is just amazing. It's really worth watching the whole thing. The film actually was not released until quite recently. There were some major technical problems with it, and I'm glad they finally sorted them out. But this album was released back in 1972, and it's a good one. At one point, you're like, oh, who is that white lady in the back row who's really getting down, really into it? Oh, it's Mick Jagger. Before we get into Aretha's recording more deeply, let's do a little background on this song, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. It's a hymn from the 19th century that is just a real standard part of the repertoire. It's sung around the world in many different languages. It originated as a poem written in 1855 by a guy named Joseph Scriven, who was trying to comfort his mother, I guess because she was back in Ireland and he was in America. And then in 1868, a lawyer named Charles Crozat Converse, which is a great name, set this poem to music. Charles Kozai-Converse is an interesting guy. He was an advocate for a gender-neutral pronoun, thon, way back in in the late 1800s. Like, he thought we should be using a gender-neutral pronoun, which is pretty cool. So we need like a more straight ahead recording of the tune to compare to Aretha's version. And the one that I like is the version that Tennessee Ernie Ford recorded in 1958.
What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer.
What a voice that guy has. Yeah. One of my students describes it as Christmas voice, which I think is pretty accurate.
Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer.
Aretha's version sounds very, very different from Tennessee Ernie Ford's version. Yeah. So here's her A section. And here is her B section. There's three big areas of difference here. There's the rhythm, there are the chords, and there's the melody. So we'll take those in order. And let's start with the rhythm. Tennessee Ernie Ford is doing the song very, very slow, like 55 beats per minute, something like that, which means that a metronome at this tempo is like slower than the second hand on a clock. That is slow.
What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear.
Aretha actually does it even slower, like 38 or 40 beats per minute. Okay, but not really. Like, she's actually double timing. She's basically doubling the length of all the notes and doubling the tempo. So she's really doing it at more like 70 beats per minute. She's also swinging, so she's using this 12/8 shuffle feel instead of the beat being like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and it's more like 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12. You could count it in any of those ways. And here's the Tennessee Ernie Ford recording with Aretha's time feel underneath it.
What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to everything to God in prayer.
Next, let's talk about the chords. The tune as written and as performed by Tennessee Ernie Ford is very, very simple, Western European descended 1, 4, and 5. And in order to be able to compare Ernie Ford and Aretha directly, I'm going to transpose Ernie Ford up into her key. And that is going to make him sound really, really weird. But yeah, it's nice to be able to compare them directly. So here are the chords in his version. We've got F, B flat, F, C, F, B flat, F, C, F. So yeah, really simple. 1, 4, and 5. Aretha adds a lot of new different chords. So we've got F, F7, B flat, F, D7, G, C7, F, F7, B flat, F, G minor 7, C7, F, B flat, F. Yeah, that is a lot more complex. There's a lot more of interest going on. That C7 is actually a complicated turnaround figure, a real interesting one. She's going C7, B flat 7 over D, A flat 7 over E flat, C7 over E. So the bass line is going C, D, E flat, E going up, and like the top note is going down, C, B flat, A flat, G. Ooh, that is cool. Contrary motion, chromatic contrary motion, really, really hip. Okay, so now let's talk about the chords in the B section. In Tennessee Ernie Ford's recording, we've got C, F, B flat, F, C, F, B flat, F, C, F. Aretha does C7, F, B flat, F, G7, C7, F, F7, B flat, F, G minor 7, C7, F, E flat, F. So yeah, a lot more complicated. And that C7, again, it's that descending, ascending, chromatic turnaround figure. That's the same as in the A section. The reason that this sounds so much more gospel-y, for lack of a better word, is Aretha's use of secondary dominants. And this is a term that requires a little bit of unpacking. So in any major or minor key, there is the tonic chord, the one chord, the home bass chord, and there is the dominant chord. And this is the basis of all Western tonal music. In the key of F major, which is the key of this song, the dominant chord is C7. C7 is built on scale degree 5. It contains the leading tone, E, and the leading tone creates this tension, this pull, and hundreds of years of Western tonal music have taught you to expect that if you hear that leading tone, it's got to resolve up to the tonic. If you hear an E in the key of F, it's got to resolve up to F. The C7 chord also includes the note B flat, the fourth, and you expect that to resolve down to A, the third. The interval between B flat and E is a tritone. It's considered very dissonant and tense. And when the E resolves up to F and the B flat resolves down to A, that resolves the tension. So C7 creates tension and uncertainty, and then resolving to F creates resolution, relaxation, a feeling of having come home. And it is this dominant to tonic resolution that defines what a key is in Western tonal theory. So what Aretha is doing is introducing some dominant chords that are not from the key of F major. So the first one she brings in is F7. That is the dominant chord in the key of B flat major. So F7 has got this E flat. That's a note from outside the key of F major. So what she's doing is saying, okay, we are temporarily in the key of B flat major. This chord F7, it's a little bit surprising in the context of F major, but it's the 5 chord in B flat. And when it resolves to that B flat chord, that resolves the tension. Next, she uses a D7 chord, and that is a very far out chord in the key of F because D7 contains the note F sharp, which is the most dissonant possible note you could use in the context of the key of F. And you hear that D7, you're like, what is that? But then what she's doing is using it as the dominant chord in the key of G. So you hear D7, but then it resolves to a G chord, and again, that retroactively makes sense out of that D7 with its wild F sharp. But when she resolves on G, it's not just a simple G major triad, it's a G7 chord. And that is another dominant chord. It's the 5 chord in the key of C. So G7 has got this tension and dissonance to it. And then when you resolve to a C chord, when you go 5 to 1 in the key of C, that resolves the dissonance. But then that C chord is not a plain triad either. It's a C7 chord, which is the 5 chord back in the key of F. So it's this whole cool chain of secondary dominants resolving to chords that are themselves secondary dominants, eventually, leading you on this kind of winding journey back to the tonic chord. Super, super hip. And yeah, a very characteristic sound of gospel music. Okay, and so how about the melody? Aretha more or less completely rewrites this melody. Like, she does hit most of the notes in it, but she adds a lot of notes of her own. And, you can compare for yourself. the pitch collection in the original song is just the F major scale, just the regular old plain vanilla Western European major scale. There is one mild wrinkle, which is that in the A section in the tune, it never uses the note B flat. And so there is the B flat chord, but the melody never uses the note B flat, which is pretty interesting because if there's any note that you would use on a B flat chord, it's going to be the note B flat. And I think what's going on is that Charles Crozat Converse wants the song to have this kind of pentatonic, this major pentatonic feeling, which makes it sound kind of folky and American rather than fully, properly Western European. I don't know whether that was intentional or it's just how the tune came out. But yeah, this thing of using a major pentatonic melody over the 1, 4, and 5 chords is more something that you hear in like folk and rock music. So for example, in The Weight by the band, the melody avoids scale degree 4 even over the 4 chord. So Aretha sings F major for most of the tune, with one important difference, which is Aretha never sings the note E. She never sings the leading tone. And not only does she not sing it in this tune, she pretty much never sings it in any tune. Like, you can listen to Aretha Franklin for a long time and never hear her sing a leading tone. And that's something that she has in common with a lot of other Black American musicians and singers and composers, where you might use the Western European 5 chord and the leading tone is there inside the chord. But in your melodies, you just don't use that leading tone. You might use 2 or 6, or you might even just use 1, which is kind of the wrong quote unquote note on the 5 chord. But yeah, you just do not use the leading tone. It makes stuff sound Western European. And if you want to sound bluesy, if you want to use the blues system, you generally want to avoid that note. But so Aretha is not only singing F major pentatonic. She bends the third A down to A flat a lot. And sometimes she bends it all the way down to A flat and sometimes just part of the way down to A flat. So she's really singing these blue thirds that are between minor and major. So it would be more accurate to say that her thirds are minor-ish or major-ish, and saying that they're minor or major is just like simplifying so that we can talk in terms of piano key pitches. And then later in the song, she also tends to bend D up towards E flat. So you kind of have this pitch collection that it's major pentatonic plus the minor third, or major pentatonic plus the minor third plus flat 7. There's not really an official name for this pitch collection. You might hear reference to this thing called the blues scale, and there's no such thing. Like, there's not a single scale that is used in the blues. This pitch collection that Aretha is using somewhat resembles this thing called the major blues scale. But then she's also kind of touching flat 7 once in a while, and like the major blues scale doesn't really account for the microtones, like the notes in between the piano keys. So yeah, if you had to pick a scale for this, I guess major blues would be it, but it's an oversimplification. Now, later in the song, she changes the pitch collection that she's using. So in the second B section, there's this really hair-raising scream. So she's singing an A flat as the main part of that scream. And that A flat does not sound to me like a bent down A. That sounds like a just minor third. Like something feels like it's shifted here. And then later in that same phrase, she starts singing entirely in the minor pentatonic. So yeah, she's really gone from F major to F minor pentatonic. And then in this like tag ending, like this final section of the tune, she only sings minor pentatonic.
My brothers and sisters, everything.
You know, her vocal style also just gets a lot more intense. There's more screaming. She lets her voice kind of break up and get ragged sounding. The general emotional intensity is a lot higher. I asked my students, like, what do you think this means, this change from major pentatonic to minor pentatonic and this more intense vocal style? And the way one of them put it is, oh, before that, she's singing the song, but after that, she's channeling the ancestors. And I thought that was really, really well put. And we're going to unpack that idea in some detail in a bit. Before we get into these larger questions about the relationship between the blues and gospel, I do want to talk about a couple of other recordings of What a Friend We Have in Jesus. So first, we're going to listen to a version by Elizabeth Cotten from 1958, same year as Tennessee Ernie Ford. I would describe her guitar style as ragtime. It's kind of bluesy and kind of folky and kind of country, but really where she's coming from is ragtime. And it's very interesting to hear a church hymn done ragtime style. Now, you could say it's not any more remarkable than hearing it done in this like kind of blues R&B gospel style, but yeah, I'm just not used to hearing gospel played as ragtime. And there's something maybe a little bit sassy and disrespectful about it. I don't know what was in Elizabeth Cotten's mind. I do know that she learned how to play guitar as a child and then stopped when she got married because she was a good Christian woman and the guitar was not considered a suitable, activity for a good Christian woman. And so she didn't play for many, 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 many decades and only came back to it when she was in her 60s. And this idea of the guitar as the devil's instrument and ragtime, blues, jazz, R&B, and rock as the devil's music is something that makes this performance a very complicated one. And again, we're going to come back to that idea in a second. Here's a beautiful recording of the tune by Willie Nelson and his sister Bobbie Nelson from 1996. It's from this album of gospel songs that they did as duets, and ooh, this album's a good one.
What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear, and what a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer.
Willie Nelson is such a great singer. He has such an idiosyncratic way of like phrasing melodies. I really love how he kind of explores the tiny crevices of it. The last version I want to talk about is by the Campbell brothers with Katie Jackson from 1997. I got this on a recording of what's called sacred steel. So gospel music played on pedal steel and lap steel guitars. And that is a whole thing. Like there's a whole kind of like subculture in the gospel world of this music being played on steel guitar. And so that's awesome. That instrument is so vocalistic. This arrangement of the song is in minor and incredibly slow. Yeah, really, really cool stuff. The relationship between blues and gospel, it's complicated and it's fraught because for Black Christians in the early part of the 20th century, there was sacred music and secular music. And sacred music in the earliest part of the 20th century was spirituals.
Dark was the night and cold the ground. Dark was the night and cold were the ground.
Secular music was blues, ragtime, jazz, and related styles. And many Black Christians felt that this secular music was sinful. Like it encouraged drinking, gambling, prostitution, sexuality out of wedlock, just is generally a source of societal instability and personal, ruin potentially. But as the 20th century went along, Black church music inevitably absorbed influence from secular genres. And one of the main drivers of that was a songwriter named Thomas Dorsey, who basically created the template for modern gospel. Thomas Dorsey had a successful career as a blues and jazz pianist. He backed people like Ma Rainey and Tampa Red, but then he had this spiritual awakening and devoted the whole rest of his life to writing sacred music. So one of his most famous songs is Take My Hand, Precious Lord. Aretha does that song really beautifully on the Amazing Grace album too, and she combines it with You've Got a Friend by Carole King, which I think is kind of amazing. Thomas Dorsey and other early gospel musicians were controversial in the Black church because it was like, wait a minute, you can't use the devil's music to praise Jesus. Like, that's just a contradiction. Now, over time, this acceptance did grow. And now when you hear a Thomas Dorsey song, like you just think of church and there's no particular conflict about it. But there was definitely some friction around the adoption of these styles in the church. Carly Jensen wrote this article that's this overview of the intertwined history of gospel and blues. The article is called What They Sang, the Religious Roots of Spirituals and Blues, and I have a link to it in the episode description. So what Carly Jensen says is the earlier spirituals from the slavery era were a way of kind of repurposing West African religious practice and singing styles into Christian worship. These songs are about Christian stories and themes, but the singing style has a lot of African retentions, and these same kind of African retentions are later passed on into gospel music and the blues. So gospel and blues have very different functions, and people are playing and singing them in very different contexts, but they have these formal similarities. So for example, they both use a lot of repetition, and the repetition serves a particular function, which is to amplify the singer's emotions and to make those emotions like more accessible and inviting to the listener. And the extremely repetitive structures of the music are a stable framework for improvisation and for audience participation and just for general kind of community building around the music. Jensen raises this question of whether Black Christians considered the blues to be devil music, possibly because they associated it with African spirituality, which is something that they probably had very conflicted feelings about, because on the one hand, it's like, well, this is our music, but on the other hand, no, we're good Christian people, and African spirituality is like heathen, and we're trying to like kind of leave that behind. There are a lot of tropes in the blues that do seem to have these origins in African spirituality. So for example, the trope of making a deal with the devil probably descends from stories of the Yoruba trickster god Eshu and the Vodun figure Papa Legba. White America has certainly taken a very negative view of the remnants of African spirituality in the Americas. When we say voodoo, that's like a mispronunciation of vodun or voodoo, and we're just like making fun of that kind of stuff as like savage and uncivilized, and probably the more middle-class Black churchgoers who maybe had some aspirations to be assimilated into white culture would have been wanting to distance themselves intentionally or not from that kind of thing. This is not really my area of expertise. I am not deep into this history. I would recommend checking out the links in the episode description if you want to see discussions of this by people who do actually know what they're talking about. Blues might seem to be like the most secular music imaginable, but Carly Jensen points out that blues songs do tend to reference God in their lyrics a lot. Like they use the phrases, "Oh Lord, good Lord, help me, Lord." And that makes sense because these blues singers, most of them are coming from a Christian background. They're mostly singing to Christian audiences. In the bar on Saturday night, they might not be in a particularly religious frame of mind, but that is still the sort of cultural backdrop that everybody shares. And sometimes that connection is very close. So the great John Lee Hooker, for example, was the son of a Baptist minister. And this Baptist minister definitely was not overjoyed about his son's interest in the blues. And so he did allow John Lee to have a guitar, but he called it the devil. And he said, the devil cannot come into my house. You got to keep that thing in the barn. John Lee Hooker definitely had some feelings about, that rejection by his father of his musical interests. So, he has this song, Burn in Hell, that is like, there ain't no heaven, there ain't no burn in hell.
Everybody talking about that burning hell. Ain't no heaven and ain't no burning hell. Where I die, where I go, can't nobody tell. I say, can't nobody tell.
That would seem to suggest some, rejection, but he also performed gospel songs in this very bluesy style. So there's a beautiful recording of him doing Ezekiel Saw the Wheel, and it sounds remarkably like the way he would approach, one of his own blues songs.
In the middle of the night, oh, child, saw the number. In the middle of the night, Lord, no man can know. Oh, Lord, oh, Ezekiel saw the number. In the middle of the night, oh, Ezekiel saw the number. In the middle of the night, Lord, Ezekiel, he saw the number, Lord. In the middle of the night, Lord, no man can know.
Carly Jensen quotes the singer Henry Townsend saying, look, the blues is just as good as gospel. And Henry Townsend said, look, in my music, I just stick to the truth. And if you can condemn the truth, then I haven't got a chance because that's all I'm telling. And, as for the blues being the devil's music, Henry Townsend says, I don't think the devil cares much for the truth. There's an older book by James Cohn called The Spirituals and the Blues. And it has a chapter called The Blues, a Secular Spiritual. And the title of that chapter pretty much summarizes this argument. What James Cohn is saying is that the blues is still a spiritual music. It just is dealing with secular topics. Like, it's depicting the secular dimension of Black experience rather than the spiritual dimension. But the structure and function of the blues is more like the spirituals than unlike them. So he says, as with the spirituals, the Africanism of the blues is related to the functional character of West African music. And this is one of the essential ingredients of Black music that distinguishes it from Western music and connects it with its African heritage. There's plenty of functional music coming from Western Europe, but the idea is in West African tradition, all music is functional. Religious observation takes the form of music a lot of the time. And so there is this sort of inherent spiritual aspect to any kind of music making. And Cohn points out, okay, so blues comes chronologically later than the spirituals, and the timing is historically important because the spirituals are slave songs and they're dealing with historical realities from the pre-Civil War era. They're sung by groups, right? It's a community music. Blues definitely has some roots in the pre-Civil War era, but mostly are a post-Civil War music, and certainly the consciousness of the blues is post-Civil War. So the blues is reflecting the experience of emancipation and the Reconstruction period and Jim Crow. And James Cohn points out emancipation was obviously a good thing, but the material situation for a lot of Black people did not improve that much for a long time. So the former Confederacy responded to emancipation by creating this rigid racial apartheid, especially after Reconstruction ended. With the Hayes Compromise of 1877, the United States withdrew federal troops from the South. In 1883, the Supreme Court declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to be unconstitutional. And then a few years later, in 1896, it upheld the separate but equal doctrine in Plessy versus Ferguson. So basically, the South reinstituted racial apartheid in every respect except for literal slavery, and the rest of the country was just like, that's fine, go ahead and do your thing. So Black people were still extremely impoverished and politically pretty completely disenfranchised. And so, naturally the blues is expressing a lot of suffering, but it's worth understanding that the music might portray suffering, but it's supposed to assuage the listener's suffering and the singer's suffering. That the music is supposed to make you feel good. It's supposed to help you endure and overcome, right? And what James Cohn says is the blues experience always is an encounter with life, its trials and tribulations, its bruises and abuses, but not without benefit of the melody and rhythm of song. The blues are a state of mind that affirms the essential worth of Black humanity, even though white people attempted to define Blacks as animals. The blues tell us about a people who refused to accept the absurdity of white society. Black people rebelled artistically and affirmed through ritual, pattern, and form that they were human beings. That Black people could transcend trouble without ignoring it means they were not destroyed by it. So, right, that the melody and the rhythm and the form of the blues, it reaffirms your humanity. It ties people together emotionally. It provides catharsis by getting these feelings out, and that it's a way of not just coping with this harsh reality, but overcoming. Cohn argues that, okay, so the blues would seem to be secular in its focus on like bodily experience and pleasure, but that is not so incompatible from spirituality as you might think, because Black American spirituality never did embrace that body-soul split that you get in white Christianity and European Christianity, that the body and sexuality are just not dirty or inherently sinful. And, this is something that I've observed in my experience of the Black church, is that, they're just a lot less uptight about the body in a way that I think is really healthy. What James Cohn says is people who have not been oppressed physically cannot know the power inherent in bodily expressions of love. That is why white Western culture makes a sharp distinction between the spirit and the body, the divine and the human, the sacred and the secular. white oppressors do not know how to come to terms with the essential spiritual function of the human body. But for Black people, the body is sacred, and they know how to use it in the expression of love. I'm not in a position to assess the truth of that statement, but I will say that if it is true, that would go a long way towards explaining why a person like me is so drawn to this music, which is I do not like the repressive atmosphere of like white people culture. And I think it's unhealthy. And yeah, it's nice to feel good in your body and not feel guilty about it. Yeah. So it's just nice to have this like alternative form of like bodily experience and this alternative spiritual value system to inhabit, like opens your mind to, critiques of the dominant white culture and gives you a break from it. It is not obvious that a person like me would enjoy listening to gospel music because A, I'm white, and B, I'm not a Christian. Like I'm a secular Jew. And I did have some like Christian religious training at the behest of one of my grandmothers, and it did not take. I remember sitting there in Sunday school being like, what does any of this have to do with anything, right? So my interest in Aretha Franklin's gospel music is certainly not out of like religious affiliation, but I definitely feel spiritual when I listen to it. And, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, what is the spirituality that you're feeling when you listen to this music? And what does it have to do with Aretha's like secular R&B and blues material? Adam Gussow has a book called Beyond the Crossroads, The Devil and the Blues Tradition. The blues musicians were aware of the irony that gospel musicians were like copying their licks. So a musician named Jack Owens is quoted in the book saying, that's what they called it all the time, the devil's music. But I have heard him make notes on the guitar and the preacher take that note and start off with it in the church behind the pulpit and go on and preach. That was a blues note. Adam Gussow cites Angela Davis's book, Blues Legacies in Black Feminism. And Angela Davis argues that blues preoccupation with sexual love has historical significance because it's an expression of the personal freedoms that Black Americans had post-emancipation. So yeah, they were still, politically disenfranchised and economically oppressed, but they did have freedom over their personal relationships and love lives in a way that they absolutely did not under slavery. As a revolutionary change, and blues is an expression of that revolutionary change. So when you have somebody like, Big Mama Thornton or Bessie Smith being kind of free and easy with their sexuality, Angela Davis is saying, right, that is a celebration of this freedom that they have. And so Adam Gussow says, well, that is certainly true. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that because the blues is very often not celebrating sexuality. It's pointing out that it is, as Gussow says, an unstable antagonistic relationship between two freely choosing sexual subjects, a zero-sum game in which one or the other participants, often as not, ends up in thrall to insatiable desire, murderous jealousy, an aching sense of loss, or ontological confusion about the maddeningly fickle devil or angel who has cast the singer into a hell on earth. Blues is the devil's music in this respect because the devil is the avatar of ungovernable sexuality, an evil spirit that incites private heartbreak and public mayhem. And yeah, I would agree, like if you're listening to classic blues, it does not make relationships sound that good, right? And, certainly a lot of these blues songs are portraying this situation in which they're just not in control of their own feelings or behaviors and are doing a lot of suffering, right? In addition to experiencing all this pleasure. And, I think that's part of the appeal of the music. It's what makes the music grown up, right? Is that it's like, okay, well, being in love is the best thing in the world, but can also be the worst thing in the world. And there's kind of no separating the pleasure from the pain. Yeah. But so with Aretha, there is a lot of pain in her music. There's a lot of pain in her voice, her timbre, right? The screaming and the torn up quality that she gets in her voice is certainly expressive of pain. But I am definitely not experiencing any pain when I'm listening to her. Quite the opposite, right? When she screams out those notes, it's not the same kind of pleasure as like eating ice cream. I definitely am like, ooh, that's intense. Maybe it's like more of a grown-up pleasure, right? It's like drinking black coffee. It's not sweet, it's bitter, but there's this sort of larger satisfaction that comes from it, even if it's not gratifying on a moment-to-moment basis. But also it is gratifying on a moment-to-moment basis because Aretha is an incredibly good musician, and her pitch sense and rhythmic phrasing are just incredibly sophisticated and advanced and nuanced. When I was trying to transcribe her recording of What a Friend We Have in Jesus into notation, I mean, you discover that Western notation is barely adequate to the task, that you have to simplify stuff quite a bit to be able to fit it onto the metrical grid, in the same way that you have to simplify the pitch nuances to fit them onto the pitch grid, onto the piano key pitches. I don't think there's necessarily a value to having her music transcribed in Western notation, because you certainly shouldn't be learning it that way. But it's an excuse to listen really closely, right? And just to inhabit the fine details of the music. When Aretha is channeling the ancestors, as my student put it, which ancestors, right? I mean, for sure her parents, right? Because her father was a renowned, famous minister, and her mother was a very highly regarded gospel singer, but also her more distant ancestors, right? And possibly going back to Africa, to the Orishas, and maybe all the way back to creation as she understands it, to the Holy Spirit, to the prophets. I don't know what was in her mind as she was singing this, but I am hearing all of the above in her, right? Like I'm hearing her expression of herself, her immediate family, her community, her grandparents, her great-grandparents, her great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, her spiritual roots, whatever she considered those to be, that it's this multi-layered complexity that keeps her music fresh every time you go back to it. Like there's so much in there. So one question is, if you're a musician and you're listening to this stuff, what is your responsibility? Like, is your job to try to imitate it? Are you supposed to try to sing like Aretha or to model your instrument playing on her? I mean, maybe. For sure, if you want to be a gospel singer or an R&B singer, you could do a lot worse than to try to sing like Aretha. But I think the responsibility is less to imitate her directly and more just to try to follow her example of trying to be as expressive as her, to have her clarity and her depth of feeling, her emotional presence and rawness and intensity, but paired with her very detailed control over her instrument and over her arrangements and her interpretations and her original music as well. And you could say, I mean, look, her version of What a Friend We Have in Jesus is basically an original song. Like it's modeled on this 19th century hymn, but it is a new piece of music. Like it's an Aretha Franklin original as much as it is an existing song. And this idea of you can transform anything into a direct expression of your own musical self is something that I think is really inspiring. You know, this music, it does this neat trick where it's very accessible, like it's fun on first listen, but then on the 500th listen, you're finding stuff in there that you didn't find on the 499th. That's a pretty remarkable thing. Thank you very much for listening.